Hi, I'm Cautex, and on this episode of the latest in Warrior Theorycrafting, I'll be discussing the extended Soulbind trees for each covenant coming in patch 9.1. In this video, I'm not going to be discussing the empowered conduit system because that's not yet on the PTR, so we have no information about what that actually means. But when it does eventually come up on the PTR, I will likely be making a video on it, so if you're interested in that analysis, then feel free to subscribe. In patch 9.1, every Soulbind is getting its tree extended to include a guaranteed potency conduit, the choice between two new Soulbind traits, the choice between an endurance conduit or a finesse conduit, and then a capstone Soulbind trait. If you don't need a brief outline of all of these traits, then I suggest skipping ahead to my thoughts and analysis, but for those who need it, let's get started. For Pelagos, you get the choice of free mastery for you and an ally, plus an endurance conduit, or a damage taken in crowd control reduction after getting crowd controlled yourself, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait provides a random proc granting 12% strength, with the added gimmick that you have to turn your character to face a thing in order to get the buff. If you soulbind with Clea, you get the choice of out-of-combat movement speed and 3% crit for 10 seconds whenever you hit a mob above 90% health, plus an endurance conduit, or your file will make you take 10% reduced damage for 8 seconds, and the effects of file get copied to a friend. The capstone trait gives you a bunch of crit based off of having and using stacks of Valiant Strikes. If you soulbind with Mechanicos, you get the choice of having a buff that cycles between 1 and 5% damage over 15 seconds, plus an endurance conduit, or physical and damage magic absorbs that work independently, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait makes Spear of Bastion apply an AoE damage dot whose damage is split between all the enemies hit, and the cooldown of Spear of Bastion gets reduced based on the number of enemies hit. If you soulbind with Plague Divisor, you get the choice of dropping a snare puddle whenever you get snared, plus an endurance conduit, or you get a 5% stagger-like effect over 5 seconds when you take damage when you're above 80% health, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait causes Banner to spawn an oozling that makes you do 2% more damage and also gives allies damage shields. If you soulbind with Emily, you get the choice of granting 20% movement speed to allies within 8 yards if you don't move for 5 seconds, plus an endurance conduit, or a magic damage absorb every minute when you're above 90% health, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait makes channeling Fleshcraft give you a bunch of pustules that pop whenever you take damage or are healed that do split AoE damage. If you soulbind with the Bonesmith, you get the choice of a beefy stacking mastery buff whenever you damage an enemy above 90% health, plus an endurance conduit, or 5% extra health when there's at least 3 enemies nearby, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait makes 3% of your damage on targets below 35% get repeated. If you soulbind with Naya, you get the choice of 20% movement speed for 5 seconds when you crit, plus an endurance conduit, or a 20% heal over 10 seconds and increased healing received whenever you drop below 50%, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait makes gaining stacks of redirected anima heal allies within 8 yards, and if those allies are not Night Fae, then the HP and mastery bonus of that stack of redirected anima are increased by 50% for 5 seconds. If you soulbind with Dreamweaver, you get the choice of an AoE snare whenever you enter Soul Shape, plus an endurance conduit, or a damage absorb for 30% of the damage that you take whenever you're below 80% health, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait basically just gives you 3% damage and healing. If you soulbind with Karain, you get the choice of reduced damage taken by targets that you interrupt or disorient for 5 seconds, plus an endurance conduit, or what basically amounts to a permanent 3% leech, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait basically inverts Wild Hunt tactics, so when you hit an enemy below 35% or heal an ally above 75%, you get 3% damage or healing done to that target for 10 seconds. If you soulbind with Nadja, you get the choice of having health pots and health stones grant a shield for 50% of the healing that they do, plus an endurance conduit, or a constant 10% AoE slow, plus an 8-yard AoE root when you're dropped below 35% health, and a finesse conduit. The capstone trait grants you 10 seconds of 20% crit or 20% versatility for 10 seconds, depending on what you have more of, whenever the Euphoria haste buff ends. If you soulbind with Theotar, you get the choice of getting healed and a damage taken reduction while standing in the Soothing Shade, plus an endurance conduit, or free speed and avoidance whenever you're well fed, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait allows you to buy a tea every day that increases the stat of your choice by 3% for 1 hour. If you soulbind with General Draven, you get the choice of having 15% of overhealing received, getting copied into a 6-second heal over time, plus an endurance conduit, or having Door of Shadows cool down 50% faster whenever you're below 50% health, plus a finesse conduit. The capstone trait gives you 1 to 3% increased damage and healing done, and 1 to 3% reduced damage taken depending on the number of enemies that are nearby. With that out of the way, let's talk about how these extended Soulbind trees will impact Warrior's preferred Soulbind for each Covenant. Or more accurately, how these preferences are not going to change at all. Night Fae is still likely going to be going Naya for single target and Karain for AoE. Venthyr is still likely to be going Nadja for raiding and also for PvP. Except if you're prot, then you're going to be staying as General Draven. Necrolord will likely still be going M&E, and Tyrion is still likely to be going Pelagos. With that said, some of the new extended trees provide a much more compelling argument for using some of the currently less meta Soulbinds, so let's talk about that. The extended Soulbind tree for Bonesmith as Necrolord makes it a much more compelling option for personal DPS, but if you decide to go Bonesmith, then you're really going to be having great fun with the diminishing returns curve on Mastery, because you're going to get a boatload of Mastery from hitting mobs above 90%, and then there's also the Mastery provided for Banner, and of course you're losing out on the fact that now Fleshcraft does damage if you're Emony. But the real big problem is that M&E grants a main stat buff to your party, and if you're going Necrolord, then you're almost certainly doing it to maximize the benefit to the group, so it makes the most sense to lean into that by going M&E, even if Bonesmith is more personal DPS. For Kyrian, Klea's new extended Soulbind tree attempts to make Valiant Strikes less garbage by giving a lot of extra crit. I can imagine a world where this proves to be better than Pelagos, but my gut feeling is that it won't be. Except for maybe in fights where you can have a really high uptime on Sphere of Archon, but Pelagos will still be the better all-round pick. Now let's look a bit more specifically at these changes for the more meta Soulbinds. For Venthyr, the Nadja change is a very welcome one, because the biggest problem with her Soulbind is that, at least until the Simcraft project that I'm working on is fully operational, Thrillseeker is a sim trap because there's so many fights where it procs while you have to be away from mobs, causing it to be completely wasted. The 10 seconds of crit or mastery that follows the haste buff doesn't outright prevent the buff from being wasted, but it makes it much less likely that you're going to waste all of the buff. How much gets wasted really depends on what the fights look like in Sanctum of Domination, but if it turns out that the timings work really well for this, it really wouldn't surprise me if there's a couple warriors out there who swapped from Venthyr to Night Fae that end up swapping back, because it's just a really, really strong buff. As for the two traits that you get to decide between, it's really just an obvious choice of this is the PvE trait and this is the PvP trait. The PvE one is definitely good, but it's pretty boring, whereas the AoE slow and root is a much more interesting idea, at least in my head. But that's not to say that it's actually really good, because I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to PvP. The Pelagos capstone trait is a big question mark for me right now because I have no idea how often it procs. There does not appear to be an internal cooldown judging by the spell data on Wowhead, and I don't have a Kyrian warrior on the PTR that I can have test things for me, so it could be insanely good, or it could just be incredibly mediocre. If you are a Kyrian and you've played around with this trait on the PTR, I would really appreciate it if you could post some comments telling me how often this effect is proccing. Once again, the two traits that you have to choose between are here's the PvE trait, here's the PvP trait, and while both of them are pretty good, there's nothing all that interesting about them. The Emity Capstone trait is, at a bare minimum, a great quality of life option because it means that you don't have to feel quite so bad about just standing there and channeling Fleshcraft in combat when you need the survivability cooldown, because you'll still be doing some damage. In the best case scenario, this could actually turn Fleshcraft into a DPS cooldown. Now, this depends on exactly how much damage these pustules are doing, but from my quick napkin math, it's looking like the pustule damage is just a little bit behind Raging Blow in Bloodthirst once you factor in the rage gained from those abilities. So that's something that I'll definitely be keeping my eyes on to see if they make any changes to the damage values of the pustules. Now, the two traits that you get to pick from is basically a choice of here's your tanking trait, and here's the trait for everybody else. That said, because the tanking trait is magic damage only, that would let tanks tailor their soulbinds for the specific encounter a bit more. And also, the group movement speed is just insanely good. And the fact that a lot of these soulbinds are getting movement bonuses suggests to me that there might be a lot of really movement-heavy fights in the upcoming raid. Though I haven't looked at the dungeon journal yet for the new encounters, so I'm just speculating. The Naya capstone trait is really good, but unfortunately it only targets people within 8 yards of you. And obviously the benefit that you get from it really depends on how many non-Night Fae melee players that are nearby. One option for potentially cheesing this bonus a bit is to stand a bit away from the melee clump and then have one non-Night Fae player stand right on top of you. This would make all of the heals go to them, and therefore mean that every single time you get a stack, you would get the bonus. Another thing that I'm curious about is whenever you use Ancient Aftershock, you get 12 stacks of redirected anima. What's not clear is whether or not these 12 stacks are going to distribute themselves evenly between all of the players that are within 8 yards, or if all of them are going to go onto a single player. The two traits that you get to choose from are both pretty nice, but again, it's pretty much a simple choice of here's the tanking trait, and then here's the trait for everybody else. The Karain capstone trait seems really good, but currently it's a bit of a buggy mess on the PTR right now. It's only proccing once per combat, even if you hit new mobs. And also, any self-healing that you do will proc the gem, and the stratagem only grants healing or damage, not both. So in other words, right now, when you take this trait, the first time that you bloodthirst, you're going to proc the gem, which gives 5% increased healing on yourself for 10 seconds. So, in other words, right now, in its current form of the PTR, it's completely useless for warriors. The thing is, though, even if this is somehow actually working as intended, Crane is still going to be the meta pick for Night Fae in keys and fights with a lot of ads, simply because First Strike is just so strong. The two traits that you have to choose from are both pretty nice, but the damage reduction on interrupts seems so situational that I think that everyone is just going to stick to the 3% leash option, even in scenarios where they could benefit from either trait. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the extended Soulbind trees that are coming in patch 9.1. I'll be releasing more videos discussing my analysis of other aspects of 9.1 that are relevant to warriors in the coming days, so keep your eyes out for those videos. But in the meantime, as always, tell me why my opinions are dumb. Also, if you've got any topics you think that I should be researching for the next episode, or if you've done some warrior theory crafting yourself and would like me to highlight your findings, let me know in the comments. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and subscribe for more.